ルの主だ。なんだ、おい、お前逃げろ。危ねえぞ。ゴムゴム。
アイス H。
海が凍った。
これが海軍本部大将の力よ。
Hey Exiles, Chronic Painless here with the Week 1 update to my Blade Vortex League Starter build guide for patch 3.20. In this video, I'll give a status report, talk through a few of the most frequently asked questions from people playing the build, and then go over the tweaks I've made to maximize Cold BV's potential in the Forbidden Sanctum lead mechanic. Overall, the build is performing as expected, which is to say extremely well. I've gotten an overwhelming amount of positive feedback from Exiles who are absolutely blasting with it, and for anyone who was struggling, there was almost always an easy fix that got them back on the right track. Big shout out to everyone on the Discord for all the help they provide. Even when I'm not around, there's always someone there who's willing to lend a hand to a prospective blaster. As for me personally, I've completed my Atlas, finished off the early endgame bosses, and done all but one of my invitations. I've also managed to get all the way through the Sanctum, except for the true form of the final boss, whose unique mechanics are pushing my potato skills to the limit. I'm confident I'll take her down soon though. Now, I'd like to quickly go over some of the FAQs that people trying this build for the first time have had. The number one issue people face is mana, where they don't feel like they can keep Vortex on left click while still being able to cast their BV whenever they need it. Sadly, many of these cases were caused by Exiles not helping our number one girl, Alira. 5 mana per second may not seem like a lot, but it's important to note that this is base regen, which gets multiplied by any source of increased mana regeneration. The next most likely solution was using a level 1 Vortex gem, which significantly reduces its mana cost. Just remember to de-level your Arcane Surge as well, so it can still trigger reliably. Finally, minus mana cost craft on rings, or increased mana regeneration suffixes on weapons or other jewelry can definitely make the difference between not enough mana and more than enough. The other most common complaint was from people who felt a little squishy in Alkangol T16s. I partially blame this perception on how hard the build blasts from Act 6 until that point, where it always feels like you're more than ready for the next ramp up in difficulty, but it is true that there's a bit of an awkward teenage phase between the late mapping loadout and tanking up. The key to getting through this stage of the build is respecting map mods, but fortunately, we don't have to respect all that many of them. Perhaps counterintuitively, the mods that are most likely to result in you losing a portal or some XP aren't the classics like minus max resistance, vulnerability, or monster speed. It's the mods that increase monster defense that are the most deadly for the build at this stage. The reason for this is that we're still relying on freeze as our first layer of defense, and monster mods that make them beefier makes freeze less reliable. Plus, these mods can be multiplicative with each other. I'll spare you the calculation, but a monster with just 40% resistance, 40% reduced extra damage taken from critical strikes, and 40% more life has an effective HP that is more than 350% of its baseline, meaning you'd need 3.5 times as much damage to freeze it. And that's just from 3 mods that would only increase this number by about 40% on their own. So if you feel like you're having trouble in late red maps, rest assured that the solution is likely as easy as occasionally using a Scour and another Alk before you go. I put the mods I'd consider re-rolling into 4 categories. Number 1, monster's action speed cannot be reduced below base value. This mod is the only one that truly bricks the build while it's still operating on little to no investment, because even though monsters can still get the frozen condition, they no longer turn into popsicles or even slow down as a result. Absolutely roll over this mod whenever you see it. Category 2 contains monsters take reduced extra damage from critical strikes, monster resistance, and monsters have more life. These mods all serve to boost a mob's EHP and their minimum freeze threshold, and since they all work differently, they have a multiplicative effect on one another that can get out of hand extremely fast. Having one of these mods on a map is usually okay, but be wary of combos with other mods on this list. In Category 3, we have monsters have a chance to suppress spell damage, and monsters have a chance to avoid elemental ailments. For suppression, even though this mod also boosts EHP, our BV hits frequently enough that we should still be able to consistently freeze targets as long as our non-suppressed damage is enough to get over the monster's minimum threshold, so watch out when combining this with other mods. For Ailment Avoid, we'll be applying so many freezes to so many targets that will all be trying to proliferate that we can often ignore it, but its effect on single targets can be palpable. Also be careful if you have Atlas points that increase the effectiveness of map mods, because while 70% avoidance is manageable, anything more could get dangerous very quickly, and 100% avoidance would be the same as the entire map being freeze immune. Category 4 is Reduced Curse Effect, Reduced Aura Effect, Cannot Inflict Exposure, and Hexproof. These mods boost the HP and raise minimum freeze threshold, but to a lesser degree than the ones above. I'd consider 2 of these to be equally dangerous to one of the true beefiness boosters in Category 2. And that's pretty much it. With the exception of Action Speed cannot be reduced, the rest of these mods are all fine in isolation, and I'd only consider re-rolling a map if it had several of them. With our clear speed, 3 to 4 hours of semi-conservative out and go should be more than enough to get you past this brief awkward phase and reach the promised land of tankiness. Also keep in mind that with freeze being so important, Brittle Ground boots are one of the first upgrades you should target as you make your way into higher tier maps. The next FAQ that I want to address are concerns about how to add Determination and Defiance banner to the build. The notes section lays out one option, but there are several others that are potentially worth considering depending on your budget level. Essence of Loathing can be used to put a mana reservation explicit on a helm or chest, and this can even be combined with an Eater of Worlds implicit on the helm. Bear in mind that if you're going after spell suppression, trying to roll a high tier of that low weight mod could be very costly with essences, but getting a usable item with some life and resists is much more reasonable. A second small mana cluster can also be fit into the build if you're willing to sacrifice a little life or damage. Consider removing critical strike nodes first, since having a 100% crit cap isn't really a necessity. Look for jewels with 3 passives and an uncompromising notable, and if you have a little more to spend, look for small passives have increased effect, because even 2% extra mana reservation efficiency can be the difference maker. Finally, you can look for ways to increase your maximum mana. Ring prefixes are the best source of this, since aside from influence mods, we'd really only care about having room for life and a minus mana cost craft. There's also a couple of nearby points that can be allocated on the passive tree, which massively boost your mana total, and can make it so that just 4 to 5% unreserved mana is suddenly more than enough. The next thing I want to talk about hasn't quite reached FAQ status just yet, but I have a feeling it's about to, and I wish I had expounded more upon it in the first guide. That is, the importance of Life Leech for the Occultist. Lacking the juiced up self-reviving stone golem of the Elementalist, the Occultist has no natural source of life regen. You could always get lucky and get some on your gear, but targeting that mod is never going to be cost effective with the other stats that we need. To make up for this, it's absolutely crucial to get a source of lifesteal if you want to do bosses and difficult maps. Fortunately, there are a litany of ways to fulfill this requirement. My personal favorite is using Anomalous Blade Vortex. As great as AoE is, 10% is going to cross a single breakpoint at most, and higher levels of investment may see this 10% getting completely lost between breakpoints. A cluster jewel with Doriani's Lesson is a close second, but with the changes to Harvest, these have become much more expensive, and therefore less desirable. It also takes the place of a potential physical damage cluster, which are extremely cost effective for what they provide to both tankiness and damage. The next best would be an amulet, either with a corrupt implicit or an explicit courtesy of the Redeemer, Shaper, or Delve. Don't forget that even corrupt amulets can now be anointed thanks to the relatively new Tainted Oil, which is fortunately quite affordable. Rings can also have Life Leech, but those only come from Delve and are difficult to improve with crafting. Watcher's Eyes can roll with Life Leech while affected by Vitality, and this works even with just a level 1 aura and its extremely low mana reservation. So if you have a little mana to spare, this can be an excellent option. Most of the time, getting a Hatred mod with this as a bonus will barely cost more than a jewel with a truly useless second implicit. As a last resort, I would use a Doriani's Invitation Belt, because even though the belt itself isn't that bad stats-wise, losing the Abyssal socket that a Stygian would provide is pretty massive. That covers the biggest FAQs, so if you have a question that I didn't cover or that isn't answered in the POB notes, don't hesitate to leave a comment or head over to the Discord. The last thing I want to discuss in this video are the changes I made to the build in response to the unique challenges posed by the Forbidden Sanctum League mechanic. Fortunately, all mobs except for the floor bosses can be frozen, so this build is performing far better than most and infinitely better than other melee builds. But there are still some changes that we can make. The first is leaning completely into the glass cannon playstyle. Tankiness does nothing to protect your resolve, whether it be from mitigation, block, or even evasion. And the number of monsters who will deplete your HP before they deplete your resolve is extremely low. I still highly recommend sticking with the tanky route if you want to progress the build through the rest of the content in the game, but for purely Sanctum purposes, a glass cannon certainly seems to be ideal. The next tweak is massive investment in area of effect. Standing right on top of monsters is not always possible when traps are going off, but we still need to keep them frozen, so improving the reach of our BV is extremely valuable. It also enables us to more reliably freeze multiple guards who have spread themselves out over the arena. I'm currently rocking a Carcass Jack, all of the AoE I could possibly get from the passive tree, and 2 vast power clusters. In that same vein, we have to improve our speed as much as possible. I went as far as adding haste instead of determination with my initial investments into mana reservation efficiency. Getting quality on shield charge and its faster attack support is palpable as well. Since the number one key to avoiding resolve damage is staying on the move, cast speed is actually impactful for this build for once, and I'm using it to augment my Assassin's Mark and Frostbomb. I also put an even higher premium than usual on automation. Curse on Hit, Arcanist Brand, Heraldry, or even Blasphemy are all worth considering for reducing the number of buttons we need to push before we're at maximum damage output. The Sanctum feels 20 times easier when all you have to worry about is dodging traps and introducing guards to your freezing blades of death as soon as possible. That's all for this video. I'll be back soon with another update, and you can always catch me on Twitch or join the Discord for more BV discussion. And as always, stay painless.